Hello, Vibers. Thank you so much for tuning in to Northern Vibe. I'm so happy to see you all here. And yes, I've had a shave. But of course, that's not the most important reason I'm live. I'm here to tell you an amazing true story. Debra Gavranich spoke to me about her immigrant mother's tale and her immigrant mother's part in the Second World War. It's an amazing story. Debra wrote down her mother's story of emigration from Australia post-World War II, just for her descendants and her family. But the actual story became a runaway success. It's done really, really well as a book. Now, Deb's not a trained writer, and this is the story, not so much of her writing, although there's a very small part of that. It's about what her mother endured, her gratitude to her new country, and how an untrained writer did write a successful book that became a publication process. So if you're a history lover, or if you're a writer, aspiring or otherwise, I think you'll really, really enjoy this. The book is called The Girl Who Left, but let's hear the story from Deb. If I could get you to tell myself and the listeners who you are and the story that kind of led to this interview.
Yes, no, my name's Debra Gavranich. I'm a local girl I grew up in Mossman, north of Cairns, and I live in Cairns now. And I'm a physio. I work 3 days a week, treating dizzy patients. But that's my day job. But in the interim, I wrote a book, and it's about my mother. Okay, it's called The Girl Who Left. If you can see it, There you go. From Croatia to the cane fields. Both my parents were born in a little village called Blato on the island of Korčula, which is part of former Yugoslavia. It's now called Croatia. In the interim, I wrote it was Yugoslavia. And for those who know a little bit about Croatia or Yugoslavia, it's got a very, very checkered history, very complicated. My dad came out to Australia in the 1920s when he was a child, and they had a sugarcane farm in North Queensland in a place called Cassowary Valley near Mossman. And then my mum was 9 years younger than him. She didn't know him, and she was born in 1932, and just prior to the World War II. And she was a child when World War II broke out, and her little island was occupied in 1941, first by the Italians for 2 years, and then by the Germans until the end of the war. And she was a child, so this story concentrates a lot on what happened to her during the occupation, what happened to the inhabitants of this village. Her older sister ran off and joined the Partisanis and was a code breaker for General Tito on the island of Vis, which was a military island. It only opened to the public probably 20 years ago. It was closed. And then it told of how her life was after World War II finished, because Yugoslavia then became communist. It was a soft communism, but it was still communist, and how life was how it was like for her in a communist country. And then it moves on to this proxy marriage, and a lot of people don't know what proxy marriages mean. They're not arranged marriages. It's a marriage where my father wasn't at it. He wrote across looking for a bride, and the families sort of knew of each other, but they didn't. And so my mother was 17, and this was her chance to get a better life, I guess, and maybe help her family, who were very, very poor. And so she agreed to this proxy marriage. It took about a year to organise. They wrote to each other, sent photos, and there's lots of lovely photos in the book of the photos they sent to each other, and they were very beautiful people. And then she agreed to marry, but she couldn't leave the country until she was married to him because of the communism. So they married, but Dad wasn't at his own wedding. So I've got wedding photos of her there with some Dad's first cousin as a proxy groom. And then after, so it's quite weird seeing she was dressed in beautiful wedding gown that my father sent material over for, because after the war there was nothing. They were making wedding dresses out of parachutes left over from the war and things like that. And so it took about a year for the documents to get in order and the health checks. And so a year after she married him, she left and came on a boat to Australia and met him for the first time a year after she'd married him, and came to this farm in the middle of nowhere. She'd left her beautiful village, her beautiful family, and there was no going back. I mean, and then it's a story of her as a new migrant in 1952 in Mossman. So, and then the story does go on about her subsequent trips back and the homeland war that happened in the 90s that she got entangled in. And I won't give away too much for those who haven't read the book. I won't do too many spoilers, but Matt, it's a book that I've had as many men as women contact me that they've loved the story because it's very historically interesting. And my publisher in Melbourne, Kathy Lewis from Wilding Oak Press, took this book on because she said there's been no book like that ever written about what happened in this little island in former Yugoslavia during the war, and then a proxy bride to the sugarcane fields of far north Queensland. It's a bit of a one-off, and it's been incredibly successful. We've been blown away by its continuing success, and it's getting more and more successful.
I want to go into the
very long synopsis.
Well, I want to go into the specifics of the success, and also I'm really interested in your writing style and you know what got you into that, because I'm finding getting quite a few creators, I suppose, watching Northern Vibe, and so people who write, people who do music, people who podcast, people who do that kind of stuff. So all these creative processes, finding out what motivates people and getting to it is actually interesting, but it is an amazing story, and it certainly hooked and intrigued me, because really let's think about the aspects to this story. Well, it's got the war aspect, and
yes,
obviously the immigration coming to
yes,
forming our country.
yes,
New Australian,
the migrant story.
Yeah, that part is amazing, because if you think about, really, it's not that many generations ago,
My mother.
things that we we live in such cushioned, comfortable times. The difficulties and hardships our ancestors faced as just as normal and overcame to deliver the magnificent world we've got now. It's kind of like,
I'll tell you a funny story about that. One of my editors was in Sydney, and she just finished reading and editing the book, and was sitting in a cafe in Double Bay in Sydney, and wiping her tears, and because there are sad parts, but they're very happy parts too. And a gentleman came and sat at the table next to her, and apparently the coffee got a bit spilled, and he got cranky at the waitress and was telling her off, and she said, I felt like turning around and saying to him, mate, you should just read this story I've just written about. Like, that's not hardship, this is hardship.
Yeah.
She said, like, people have got no idea the resilience and the hardship like our parents went through. It was like,
yeah.
would you like
a cube of concrete with your coffee to harden up a bit?
Basically, she said, what are you complaining about? Spilled coffee, like, dear.
well, let's briefly talk about because the Balkans, I suppose, the war in that part of the world isn't something that we kind of know a lot about. It was actually a very important campaign. The British put a lot of resources in there. I know SOE, Special Operative SOE, were very, very active in that area. There was a fair degree of ambivalence because there were all these resistance groups, but it seemed that the most organised.
Who do you support? That was the first question for the Allies. Who do we support?
Exactly, and the most, from my reading, the most effective were Tito's, but I mean they're a bunch of communists, and well,
it's very interesting. I did a lot of historical research about Churchill's comments. Was like, because first of all they supported the Chetniks, which were the royalists, but the Chetniks sort of were collaborating with the Germans.
They kind of were.
Yeah, they were, and they the partisans were really tough, and like if they killed soldiers and then the fascists then killed villagers, they it was like, well, that's war. We're not going to stop because you're killing civilians, and that's what they did do. But Churchill apparently said to Fitzroy McLean, who's one of the characters, he's a real life person in my book, like, what are we, we're basically going to be propping up this communist regime. What's going to happen after the war? And they said, well, it's their country. Let's just deal with the war. They're not going to be in our backyard. Let's just see who's going to help us win, basically.
Yeah, and really, because there was a communist uprising right after the war, led by Tito. But guess where all the arms and ammunition came from? They were British surplus left over. They were dropped by SOE.
Yeah, they dropped radios, and because that's what they needed. They needed ammunition. They needed radios. But apparently, it's the only country during World War II that was basically fought by the locals.
Yeah,
it was propped by the Allies, but they weren't in active war. It was more the local partisanes that fought the fascists. So very interesting. And also the fact that how it was initially divided up. The North, Germany took the North and Italy took the South, which was a very interesting scenario as well. So her village, she was occupied by two different forces.
Well, I mean, Churchill talks about his ambivalence, and fundamentally, and he was right. He goes, well, okay, the Nazis are really bad, and like I loathe these guys, and I've loathed them since the 30s, because as we know historically, he was the one, because everyone was calling him a warmonger. In the 30s, he was like, these guys are bad.
He's bad.
These guys are really bad.
They're going to be worse.
Well, see, he hated the communists, even more, and he was like, man, I think these guys are even more of the totalitarians. And I think the only thing that really saved, in inverted commas, Yugoslavia, because it was still, we've got to recognize, like, Tito's dictatorship was an evil, nasty communist dictatorship.
It was.
The thing that kind of saved him, made him kind of redeemable, was that he loathed Stalin.
Yes, Stalin tried to kill him so many times, and
him and Stalin hated each other's guts.
Yep. And he eventually sent a note back saying, stop sending people to assassinate me, or else I'll send someone to assassinate you. It's basically, and his communism was a soft communism. And then it leads in, it's quite interesting, because then it leads into the fall of communism, and after Tito died, and the Homeland War, and all the different immigrants that came to Australia, and the times they immigrated depended. It was interesting, their attitude to former Yugoslavia and Croatia. They're very different groups of people. Very different groups of people.
I can tell a quick anecdote about that, and I think I didn't get to fully tell you, although I did mention this at the book thing. I was stationed at a place called Winton in far west Queensland. It's about 1,000 kilometres.
I've been to Winton.
Right. There's a little place outside of Winton. It's in the Winton Police District called Opalton. Now, as you can tell from the town name, it's an open mining community. There's no running water. There's no nothing. It's people living not so much underground, because it's not like it's not hilly country. It's more people living in tents and caravans, and a couple of people underground, but most of them are living in and it's a hand mining thing. So you're not allowed to have pneumonic equipment there, right? It's a hand, there are people like picks and it's the 1800s. Now there were these two Yugoslavian guys, both of them whose name was Drago, which, as you know, means dragon. And there was I can't pronounce it in Yugoslavian, although I did know it. But translated, they called each other Red Drago and Black Drago.
Okay.
Now that was because one of them was a communist and one of them was a Chetnik /
Yeah.
Anyway, so these guys escaped Yugoslavia. They're working together under the ground for 40 years. This incredible kind of closeness. Now, when that war flared up in the early 90s, that terrible, terrible civil war in Yugoslavia, and again, we kind of don't know, we forget just how bad that was.
They nearly destroyed Dubrovnik.
Oh,
yeah.
It was
Dubrovnik,
so bad.
who's UNESCO listed, was bombarded.
One of the most beautiful cities in the world, this medieval, gorgeous... Anyway, these guys ended up shooting each other and shooting at each other over that war, and one of them killed the other. 40 they got out in about 47. So it was
After the
40,
war.
50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 50
Yeah.
years under the ground working
Yeah.
with each other. And
Yeah.
then I'm shooting like,
Yeah. No, the history is very, very complex. And that's why I did a lot of research for my book. And I tried very hard to make the language apolitical. It wasn't,
yeah,
it was the history that happened in the background of my mother's life,
yeah,
basically.
yeah.
And I didn't want to show any sides were good sides or this is
Yep.
just how my mother's life was. And this is, as a child, what she lived through and then what she came back to as an adult.
And of course, you know, another big part of it is religion, because
Yes.
we know Yugoslavia is like, so it's got
Catholics.
Orthodox,
Muslim.
and the Muslims.
Yes, yes, and that adds another layer again. And that was really interesting. And that's an interesting part of my book, because the war on the island, from what I can gather talking to people, is very different to the war on the mainland. Because on the island, we didn't have mixes. Like on the mainland, you have the Serbs, the Croatians, the Muslims, whereas on the island, and the three different religions, whereas on the island, we were all Catholic, we were all Croatian. So there were no mixed marriages, so which made it a little bit easier. And so even though my auntie was a partisani, she was a Catholic. She wasn't communist. After the war, I'm not sure whether she joined, which she kept in the party, but we were my mother's first cousin was the Catholic priest in the village. Very strong Catholics. And there's a very Catholic thread through my book. And the Catholic priests helped the partisanis on the island, whereas on the mainland, the partisanis were killing the priests.
Yeah.
So it's got another layer again, because unless you were from the island, you didn't realize, you presumed that the partisanis were terrible to the priests, but on our island, they weren't. Because they were all just trying to get rid of the occupiers.
Yeah.
It wasn't really, I want to join the party. It was like, I'm Catholic, I want to stay Catholic, but I want this war over.
Yeah.
So a different slant, I think.
And then again, this is, to me, I'm a history geek, and this is all so interesting.
Yeah.
And we forget, like, you know, you forget these things and forget the complications of history, and you do so at your own peril. But let's talk about really, I know you've touched on the immigration experience. That really was the new Australians, like, just for everybody who, I understand it's not even taught nowadays, unfortunately, but there was we've all heard of the 10-pound poms, but right after the war, there was a big push by the government to get immigrants, especially from the Balkans, Mediterranean places,
Yeah.
not from the British Isles, which is traditionally where most of our immigrants came from. So to integrate that, I think the government did it really well. Actually, they said, okay, well, how are we going to immigrate? How are we going to assimilate these people? There are cultural differences.
Yes.
How are we going to focus on it? And they focused on this concept of new Australians. Can you talk a little bit about your mother's experience with that and how she found Australia when she got here?
Well, it's really interesting, because there's another character in my book, because they're all live people in my book. And some of them are still alive today. And my godmother was a proxy bride as well, and came out the same year as my mother. And she was my dad's cousin. She was my dad's cousin on one side and married my dad's cousin on the other side. So like my dad, yeah, anyway, but they weren't related. And she went to a sugarcane farm at Falulga near Tully, to a community where there were no Croatians. They were called Yugoslavs. We called ourselves Yugoslavs because, it was still that was the name of the country. And her experience was really very, very different to my mother's. My mother came to Kasserere Valley near Mossman, north of Cairns. She came to a household where she had a father-in-law who was quite terrible, but a sister-in-law who was lovely. So she came to a household where they spoke Croatian. She came to a town that had a lot of Italian and Yugoslav migrants. So whereas my godmother was very isolated. So my mum came to this town that she was the only proxy bride. It was quite an unusual thing. But she was very, very welcomed. And my mother was a woman that was not hard to love. She turned 20 on the boat coming over, had no English. She could speak a bit of Italian because during the war, the Italians took over the schools and made them learn Italian. So she could speak some Italian, spoke no English. But they made her learn English very quickly. They played lots of tricks on her, asking her to go into shops and ask for rude things and things. Things. And so she was very determined to learn English very quickly. And she, even though she was incredibly homesick, I was at a 80th birthday party last night, and there was a man there he would be in his 80s now, who was from Mossman, who was actually 14 and was at my parents'. They had a party when she arrived, and he was telling me that he was at that party.
Oh, wow.
So he knew my parents and said she was beautiful, but she spoke no English. And there were a lot of Australians at the party. And then I met someone last week, so it's quite intriguing, whose mother-in-law was also at this party, and she was a 13-year-old girl, and she told the story that halfway through the party, my mother was sitting on the back stairs crying because she was so overwhelmed by this party, and this 13-year-old girl sat next to her, not able to talk to her, but was hugging her. Wow. And I thought that was quite poignant. I'd never heard that story, and this was told to me last week. So, it was really hard because she left. She was from a close family. She was especially close to her father, and she never did see him again. And she was, she had two sisters, a brother, and she was from this little village that was about, at one stage was probably the time she left was about 5,000 people. It's about 3,000, 2,500 now because there's so many have immigrated, and there was no one. She knew no one. Okay, and she couldn't go back. There was my original title for my book. I was going to call it One Way Ticket because that's what it was. And so it was very, very hard. But, all the time, I won't give away too much. She did go back sometime, but that's quite interesting when she did.
Sure.
But she was, even though she was so homesick, as a child growing up, she never, ever regretted her decision. She was really grateful to Australia, and she embraced the democracy, the fact that there was no war. That was her fear, that there was going to be a war again, and there was in the 90s. There was another war. Okay. And she was because as a child she saw some horrendous things, but it's funny, like people talk about PTSD. I think her faith was so strong. I mean, she couldn't watch war movies, but she was a really positive woman, and so grateful for what Australia gave her, and the opportunities that we had. And both our parents were very, very forward thinking, like valued education above all things because they didn't get an education. And they were both very clever people. And my dad wanted to be a doctor and my mum wanted to be a teacher. And so we were encouraged. And I have two sisters and a brother, and 3 out of 4 of us went to university. And my father said, just because you're a woman doesn't mean you don't get an education. You need an education so you don't have to rely on a man, which was very forward thinking in the 60s and 70s.
The other thing I find really reassuring about this is because the narrative that's kind of portrayed, especially by the media, with one notable exception that I'm going to talk about in a minute, is like this evil, white, oppressive place treated everybody like crap when they came over. That's kind of not what happened.
Oh, no, I disagree. I interviewed a lot of the older migrants that came to Mossman, and they said there was a lot of racism when they came.
Okay.
And they tried to get jobs.
How did it manifest?
Well, they all tried to, in Mossman and sugarcane, there was a sugarcane mill, sugarcane farms. They all were cane cutters because there were no harvesters until the 70s. And they said when they first came, they'd go to I forget the place that it'll come to me, where you got the job for the sugarcane farms. And you sit there and you'd register and then you'd wait for a job. and they'd give the British, they call them Britishers. The
Yeah.
Britishers all got the good jobs.
Yep.
Okay. And then they'd wait till they all had their jobs. And then they'd say, okay, non-Britishers, which
Yep.
were the Italians and the Yugoslavs, then got the bad jobs.
Yeah.
So, and they said there was a lot of, until there was enough of them in the community that really they realized actually the Italians and Yugoslavs worked really hard.
Yeah.
And, but see, my mother wasn't there to work, so she didn't experience that. And she initially was in a Yugoslav community.
Yep. So yeah, I mean, you do get that too. I mean, the Irish got that.
Yeah.
I mean, with my surname. So, you know, each new wave of people gets assimilated, and then they join the main group and they treat the next wave of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But growing up, it was really interesting because one of my friends said, you know, I've never sort of had a cringe about my nationality. And I said, no, I've always been a very proud Croatian woman. And growing up in primary and high school, I went to a boarding school in Herberton. Half my class, 3/4 of my class were migrants' kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we felt very much part of enmeshed in the community.
I saw this excellent SBS documentary, and I actually don't watch the SBS all that much. And it was really funny watching this interviewer speak to this chap who was in his 80s and going, oh, you know, tell me about your experience. And the narrative that the interviewer wanted was like, you were just treated like crap, weren't you? This country just sucks. And this guy was like, I mean, no. He kind of like, I mean, did I face some, you know, were there some negative stuff? Yeah. Were there some language barriers? Yes. Were there some cultural things? Yes. Were there a couple of times that I wasn't treated with the appropriate amount of respect personally? Yes. And then he said, and something that this part of the interview really warmed my heart. He said, the most indicative thing for him was that they had to go and register. He goes, so they're all aliens at that time.
Yes, they got on my mother's registering, it's called alien.
So even, you know, the show was trying to frame that as like, even that is just indicative. It's like, well, you know, it was the process, it was the language you used. It didn't mean, anyway, they're reading stuff into it. But like, as part of being an alien, this guy had to go and check into the police station. So like he had to go and register there. So this guy's come into the police station, and this Irish cop, you know, this Irish, you know, with a Irish surname, red beard and all that kind of stuff, was like registering, and he's going through all the paperwork, and this guy's going, oh, okay, you know, is it done? He goes, and this copper goes, yeah, no worries. One more thing. So he opens the front counter, then comes around, sticks out his hand and goes, welcome to Australia. Thanks for coming.
That's lovely.
I know, right? And he said that. And so this guy in the interview, he goes, that was indicative. So, I mean, it's not that these bad things didn't happen, and it's not that these things, but is that indicative of the country that he came to, the people that we were?
I think we're a wonderful multicultural country, and I'm really grateful for so many different nationalities. We're a kaleidoscope.
And look, I think you know, and I'm not denying the experience that you just outlined, you know, the bottom of the pile workers. Yeah, totally, 100%. I mean, you know, you kind of listen to that and go, yeah, that would have happened. Like, I've heard stories like that from some of my ancestors.
Yeah.
But
you know, in the grand scheme of things, that was minor. Like our families were very much part of the framework of the small town of Mossman, and very loved.
Yeah.
We loved.
You know, you kind of like see that. And I think we genuinely go hard on ourselves now, and even trying to paint our history as one of this. It's just, you know.
I agree with you, Matt.
But see, again, we're not denying that these things didn't happen. My argument is it's not definitive.
No.
It doesn't define us as a people.
And I think generally Australians I've traveled a lot through Europe.
Yep.
And Australians are very easygoing and accepting, and I find us very accepting of nationalities, and appreciative of what it adds to our community.
Yeah, I mean, you know, really all of us are immigrants. And even like, I've even said this to a lot of Indigenous mates when they go, well, we're not, and go, well, actually, you guys came through a land bridge, so technically, unless
just a lot earlier than us.
Just earlier than us. Like, yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, but like, you're an immigrant too, buddy.
Exactly. I agree with you, Matt. Yeah, no, it's very, And it's interesting because my book, even though it's about Croatia or former Yugoslavia, it's touched a nerve with a lot of migrants, because as you say, it can be the British migrant, it can be, and I was interviewed by Sarah Konoski on ABC Conversations when it first came out, and it's a podcast and it's an amazing interview, but she's replayed it twice. And they emailed me last year on Australia Day and replayed it on Australia Day because she said it's a wonderful migrant story.
Yeah. Okay. So look, I suppose we're kind of like at the, we know now too, I was going to ask you directly what inspired you to tell the story, but the story is such an inspirational one. Clearly that's what made, it's a story that needed to be told.
And I was only going to tell it to, I was only going to self-publish. It wasn't for the general public.
Oh, so look, how well is it doing? Talk us through that. How did you get it published?
Oh, it's amazing. It's been a dream journey. Well, it's into its 23rd print run. We've sold out again at the Writers' Festival. There's another 400 of arriving in the warehouse in Sydney as we speak, and we're getting I think 6 boxes sent up to Cairns, because I supply the Cairns Museum, sell it, the Brisbane Museum sell it, a lot of independent bookstores around the Tablelands, coffee shops sell it. So we've sold out, I don't know how many thousands. It's just like I haven't got a clue, but it's incredible. And but I was really only writing it for my children. I was only going to self-publish it because I wanted to write it because they never knew my parents. My dad died before I had children. They both died very young, and he died before I married. And my children were all under 5 when my mum passed, so they've got very few. Well, the eldest one, they got really no memories of my mother. So it was for them. I thought, like, they need to know who their grandmother was, and what an amazing woman. And also, there's been a trickle-on effect, because my cousins all over, it's about their auntie, but also their mother is a major character. She turned 93 last week, and she's in Mossman, and she came to the festival, and she was signing books with me, as well as my 88-year-old godmother. It was just amazing. It was just it touched my heart. And so it's all my extended family have thanked me for chronicling this story, because it's their heritage. Okay, because a lot of them, to say, okay, this is where your families have come from. So I was going to self-publish it, and then I asked my editor, and I had a beta editor in Cairns who was a Croatian woman who read it for me and said, you should try and get this published, it's really good. And I asked my editor in Brisbane, should I? And she actually deterred me. She said, look, who have you written it for? And I said, family. And she said, well, if you go to a commercial publisher, they'll want to make it as commercially viable as possible. It's all about dollars. So they will try and change the story, change your characters. Do you want that? And I said, no, a lot of these people are still alive. And that wasn't the aim of my book, is to write a book. It was to write my mother's story.
Yeah.
So I didn't do it. So we were about a month away from going to print. I had a sourced a printer in the Sunshine Coast, and we had organised a launch date in Cairns. And unbeknownst to me, my nephew in Canberra had already booked his flight. When I thought, I'll just see what's out there. And I actually submitted it to 5 different publishing houses. And I got responses very quickly from 2 of them. And one of the publishing houses didn't really align with my values, so I didn't go up on that offer. But the other one was very much, I looked at the books she published, and they were very much like, a lot of them are award-winning books, actually. She's very successful, and she's an independent publisher in Melbourne called Wildingo Press. And so I had to put a break on everything, because once I agreed, I had to sign a big contract and everything like that. And so then the story was then hers. And she's been amazing, Kathy Laws from Wildingo Press. And so it just went viral from then, because then I got a publicist from Sydney, Rachel McDermott, who organised all the interviews for me. I've been interviewed by, as you say, ABC Conversations, which is about as good as you can get for an author. because you know, so many people have listened to the podcast and have contacted me. I've been interviewed by Indira Naidu from ABC Nightlife, and I've had probably about 15 interviews, some of them live, that my publicist has organised for me. I've been interviewed in Croatia. I was on the Croatian national news 2 weeks ago with my book. So
Wow.
once, yeah, I know, crazy, hey. I was the only one that was speaking English. I got dubbed, but anyway, I'm learning. I mean, my Croatian's.
I was going to say, can you speak Croatian?
Yeah, yeah, govorim, but nije dobro. I don't. I'm tako, which is so, and I speak a lot of dialect, which is not.
Yeah. And accented. It'll be heavily
Yeah, well,
Australian accent. You know, it's like.
Oh
Aussie
yeah, I sounded very bogan, yeah. And, anyway, so it's actually because I've got a publisher, you have a distributor which can get you to any bookstore. If you're self-published, you can normally only go into independent bookstores, but with which I didn't know, with a distributor and a publisher, you know, you get into the QBDs and the, you know, all the different, and all through Australia and New Zealand. So, and I did a New Zealand book tour last year, which was incredibly successful. We did 12 events in 14 days. And I met cousins, as you do, you know, over there that I never knew. I've met a whole lot of relatives and close relatives, like second cousins that I'd never heard of on my father's side, that read the book and worked out that we were related. So it's been been an amazing, it's 2.5 years since it's been published, and it's actually gaining more and more traction.
It's
It's my family is blown away by the whole journey, and we're taking it to Croatia in June. I've got events booked there, and we're going to try and find a publisher over there. But at this stage, there are bookshops that wanted the English version because it's for tourists. So we're going to get my publisher's organising a printer in Europe to be printing them so they can access them easily in Croatia.
fantastic. And how long did it take you to write?
I was working full time up until I started to write, and then I dropped a day. I was working 4 days a week. And so Wednesday was my writing day. And so it took me 3 years. And I didn't know I could write, Matt. I just started writing away. And that's when my publisher said, "You're a physio. How can you write so well?" I didn't know I could write. And I don't want to write anymore. I mean, I've met a lot of wonderful authors through all the writers' festivals I've been to. And I've been on a lot of panels and things like that. And they all say, "You'll write again, you'll write again." And I said, no, because, you know, I have my day job that I'm very passionate about. And, you know, I didn't grow up saying I want to be an author. I grew up saying I want to write my mother's story. And I've done that. And, you know, I don't want to sit and write again. I can write, but, you know, I don't need to.
Yeah. Good on you.
Thank you.
Is there any words of wisdom, I suppose, or is there anything you'd like to tell the listeners before we wrap it up?
Yeah. My mother's story, is one of many. And since I've written it, I'm still getting contacted weekly by people I don't know, half the men saying how much they love the story, or people telling me their family stories. And I've heard some amazing stories and of migrants, and they're lost. They're getting lost. And like, I've got my mother's in print, and I'm really, really happy I've done that, because I had to, I didn't get all the stories when she was alive. She died 27 years ago. Okay. So I had to go to Croatia and interview people. I interviewed a lot of people who knew her and my dad died 9 years before then. So, you know, so I'm saying we need to capture these stories. And so even if it's just for your own family, you know, fair enough. Some people, especially during the war, don't want to talk about it, but even talk about their experiences coming to Australia, like, and not just former Yugoslav, you know, Italians, Greeks, English, Irish. And I say, you know, one of the ladies I interviewed, she was a neighbour on the neighbouring farm. She told me lots of stories, and now she's not cognitive, okay? She's got dementia. So there was a little window I got in before that happened. And so I'm saying, you know, if your family members are still alive and they're cognitive, get their story. Even if you're on your phone, just ask them questions. And that's what I did in Croatia. I just turned my phone on and asked my aunts and uncles questions and got them talking. And that's quite wonderful that I've got their voices too. And then just get it, because you don't know what you might use that for. You might be able to write it, or you might have a family member who down the track can write it. And I think these are stories are really, really important for the generations that follow. Because this is the making of our migrant country.
Totally.
So that's what I'm saying. There's a lot of wonderful stories that are getting lost.
100%. And considering that we live in a narrative, remembering stories is very, very important.